Everyone imagines the same version of war: tanks punching across flat desert terrain, fighter jets clearing the sky within 48 hours, precision-guided munitions disassembling command centers one by one, a capital city surrounded, besieged, and captured, a government collapsing, a president standing in front of cameras declaring mission accomplished. That is the version of war people carry inside their heads because it is the version they have been shown before. In March of 2003, American and coalition forces crossed the Kuwaiti border into southern Iraq. Within 21 days, Baghdad had fallen. The Iraqi military, once considered the fourth largest standing army on earth, disintegrated under the weight of overwhelming American air superiority, precision strikes, and fast-moving armored columns racing north through open terrain. And because that image, that speed, that dominance, that almost surgical collapse of an entire nation's defenses was broadcast around the world in real time, it created a belief, a deeply embedded assumption that the United States could replicate that result anywhere, against anyone, under any conditions. But that assumption is wrong. Not because American military power has weakened, it has not. The United States still operates the most advanced, most heavily funded, most technologically sophisticated military force in human history. But because the assumption confuses winning battles with winning wars, and those are two fundamentally different things. If the United States ever launches a ground invasion of Iran, the first question any serious analyst must ask is not whether American forces can win the opening battles. They almost certainly would. The question, the only question that actually matters, is where exactly that army gets trapped, and how long it takes before the people who sent it there realize that the trap was waiting from the very beginning. Historical comparison. History does not repeat itself exactly, but it offers patterns that only the reckless choose to ignore. When American forces entered Afghanistan in October of 2001, the initial campaign was considered a masterpiece of modern warfare. Special operations teams working alongside local Afghan militias, supported by devastating American air power, dismantled the Taliban government within weeks. The operation seemed fast, efficient, and decisive. But then the occupation began. And the occupation is where the real war always lives. Within 2 years, the Taliban had regrouped. Within 5 years, they were launching coordinated attacks across multiple provinces. Within 10 years, the United States was deploying over 100,000 troops and spending more than $100 billion annually just to maintain a stalemate in a country roughly the size of Texas. After 20 years, more than 2,000 American soldiers dead, over 20,000 wounded, and more than $2 trillion spent, the United States withdrew. The Taliban returned to power within 11 days of that withdrawal. Afghanistan was a country of roughly 38 million people, with a fractured government, limited infrastructure, and no centralized professional military. Iran has more than 85 million citizens, a standing military of over 600,000 active duty personnel, an additional organized reserve force exceeding 350,000, and a parallel paramilitary structure, the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps, with its own ground forces, naval units, air assets, intelligence networks, and deeply embedded ideological commitment to national defense. If 20 years in Afghanistan produced exhaustion, political fracture, and eventual withdrawal, the structural conditions inside Iran suggest something far worse. Not because Iran's soldiers are individually superior to Afghan fighters, but because the system surrounding the battlefield, the geography, the logistics, the politics, the regional network, creates a trap that compounds over time rather than resolving. And that trap begins with a problem most people never think about. Where does the invasion even start? Staging and political constraints. An army does not simply appear on a battlefield. It must be assembled, staged, supplied, organized, and launched from somewhere. And in modern warfare, that somewhere is not a minor detail. It is one of the most critical strategic decisions of the entire campaign. Because the location of staging determines supply line length, vulnerability to preemptive strikes, political sustainability, and the operational corridors available for the initial advance. In 2003, the invasion of Iraq staged primarily from Kuwait. American forces had spent more than a decade maintaining massive military infrastructure there following the 1991 Gulf War. The political relationship was stable. The geography was favorable. Open, flat desert terrain connected Kuwait directly to southern Iraq, allowing armored columns to advance rapidly with minimal natural obstacles. Iran presents none of those advantages. Look west. Iraq shares a border with Iran stretching over 1,500 kilometers. In theory, this might appear to be the most logical invasion route. But Iraq today is not the Iraq of 2003. The current Iraqi government maintains extensive political, economic, and religious ties with Tehran. Iraqi political leaders have publicly and repeatedly stated that Iraqi territory cannot be used as a staging ground for any military operation against Iran. If the United States attempted to overrule that position and use Iraqi bases regardless, it would immediately destabilize the entire Iraqi political structure, a structure that cost America 2 decades of military commitment and an estimated $3 trillion to construct. And even if Iraqi cooperation were somehow secured, American forces pushing east from Iraq into Iran would immediately encounter the Zagros mountain range, a wall of stone stretching the length of the border. There are no open highways leading into the Iranian heartland from the west. There are mountain passes, and mountain passes are where armies go to die. Look north. Turkey is a NATO member, which might suggest automatic alignment with American strategic objectives. But Turkey, under its current leadership, operates with an increasingly independent foreign policy calculus. Ankara has economic relationships with Tehran. Turkish energy security depends partly on Iranian natural gas. And Turkish leadership has no interest in allowing its territory to become a launchpad for a war that could invite Iranian ballistic missiles targeting Turkish cities, military installations, and critical infrastructure. NATO membership does not mean unconditional obedience. Turkey demonstrated this clearly during the 2003 Iraq War, when it refused to allow American ground forces to open a northern front through Turkish territory. Look south across the Persian Gulf. The United States maintains significant military installations in Qatar, Bahrain, the United Arab Emirates, and Kuwait. Aircraft carriers and naval strike groups patrol the Gulf waters. These facilities provide critical air and naval power projection capability, but they do not solve the fundamental ground force problem. Amphibious operations against a defended coastline, particularly one bristling with anti-ship missiles, coastal defense batteries, and fast attack naval units operating in shallow, restricted waters, carry enormous risk and cannot deliver the volume of troops and heavy equipment needed for a sustained ground campaign. Every direction has a wall, physical, political, or strategic. And behind every wall stands a deeper problem, the supply line. Logistics and supply line vulnerability. There is a phrase attributed to various military thinkers across centuries, and despite being quoted so often that it has almost lost its meaning, it remains the single most important truth in warfare. Amateurs study tactics. Professionals study logistics. Every soldier on a modern battlefield consumes an extraordinary amount of resources every single day. Food, water, ammunition, fuel for vehicles, generators, and aircraft, batteries for communication equipment and targeting systems, medical supplies, spare parts for weapons, vehicles, and electronics that break down constantly under combat conditions, clothing and protective equipment that wears out, gets damaged, or becomes contaminated. During the Iraq War, the United States military consumed approximately 1.7 million gallons of fuel per day. That number would almost certainly increase in Iran, where the distances are far greater, the terrain far more demanding on vehicles, and the operational area significantly more expansive. All of that material must travel from somewhere to everywhere, from factories and depots in the United States, across oceans, through ports, along roads, through mountain passes, and into the hands of the soldiers who need it. If any point in that chain breaks, any single link, the entire system begins to degrade. Soldiers run low on ammunition. Vehicles stop because there is no fuel. Wounded cannot be evacuated because helicopters are grounded for maintenance that cannot be performed without parts that have not arrived. Iran understands this with absolute clarity. For more than 3 decades, Iranian military doctrine has not been built around defeating the American military in a conventional head-to-head engagement. Iran's strategists know they cannot match American firepower in open battle. Instead, they have built an entire military philosophy around one concept, making the logistics of an American invasion so painful, so costly, and so relentlessly disrupted that the campaign becomes unsustainable. The Persian Gulf, through which the vast majority of supplies for any southern-based operation would need to travel, is a narrow, shallow body of water. At its narrowest point, the Strait of Hormuz, it is only 33 kilometers wide. Iranian anti-ship cruise missiles, naval mines, fast attack boats armed with torpedoes and explosives, drone swarms, and shore-based missile batteries can threaten every vessel transiting that strait. Even if they cannot close the strait entirely, and that remains a serious debate among military analysts, they do not need to close it. They only need to slow it down. They only need to force supply ships into longer, more expensive alternative routes. They only need to sink or damage a small number of vessels to create an insurance crisis that raises shipping costs to prohibitive levels across the entire global energy market. And every day the supply chain slows down, the army at the end of that chain gets weaker. Not because the soldiers have lost courage, but because courage without ammunition is just bravery waiting to become a casualty. Terrain advantage and mountain warfare. Open any topographical map of Iran and the problem becomes immediately, viscerally obvious. The Zagros Mountains run along the entire western and southwestern edge of the country for over 1,500 kilometers. These are not rolling foothills. These are jagged, steep, deeply folded mountain chains with peaks exceeding 4,000 meters. The valleys between them are narrow, winding, and often impassable to heavy armored vehicles. Roads, where they exist at all, are few, predictable, and carved into the sides of cliffs where a single destroyed vehicle can block an entire column for hours. Along the northern border, the Alborz Range dominates the landscape. Mount Damavand, the highest peak in all of Western Asia, rises to 5,610 meters. Snow covers the higher elevations for months. Fog, rain, and extreme cold can ground helicopters, blind surveillance drones, and reduce infantry movement to a crawl. Between these mountain ranges lies the vast central Iranian plateau, a high-altitude desert with extreme temperature swings, limited water sources, and enormous distances between population centers. Crossing it requires fuel, water resupply, and vehicle maintenance on a scale that would strain any logistics system even without enemy interference. Now consider what this terrain means for the defending force. Iran has spent decades, not months, not years, but decades, preparing defensive positions throughout these mountains. Underground tunnels, hardened bunkers, pre-positioned weapons caches, concealed rocket and missile launch sites, observation posts with clear lines of sight over every major approach route, communication networks designed to function even when satellites are jammed and electronic warfare blankets the electromagnetic spectrum. When a military convoy enters a mountain pass, it loses almost every advantage that modern technology provides. Armored vehicles cannot maneuver off-road because there is no off-road, only cliff faces and ravines. Air support becomes less effective because targets are concealed in caves, tunnels, and behind rock formations that absorb blast energy. Artillery must fire at extreme angles and often cannot reach positions on reverse slopes. Helicopters become vulnerable to shoulder-fired missiles launched from positions above them, a geometry that negates many of their defensive countermeasures. An ambush in a mountain pass follows a devastatingly simple pattern. destroy the lead vehicle, destroy the rear vehicle. The entire column is now stationary, trapped between two burning wrecks, with no room to turn around, no space to disperse, and no cover from fire pouring down from positions hundreds of meters above. This pattern is as old as organized warfare itself. The Romans experienced it at the Battle of the Teutoburg Forest. The British experienced it repeatedly during the Anglo-Afghan Wars. The Soviets experienced it throughout their decade-long catastrophe in Afghanistan. The Americans experienced it in Korea's frozen mountain passes and in the winding valleys of eastern Afghanistan. The mountains do not care how advanced your technology is. They care only about physics. And physics in mountain warfare always favors the defender. Your domestic political pressure and economic strain. While the military fights one war on the ground in Iran, an entirely different war begins at home. And historically, it is the war at home that determines whether the war abroad continues or collapses. The United States entered the Vietnam War with broad public support and political consensus. Within 5 years, that consensus had shattered. Protests filled the streets. Universities became battlegrounds between students and police. Politicians who had initially supported the war reversed their positions as casualty numbers climbed and the promised victory never materialized. The war did not end because the American military was defeated on the battlefield. The war ended because the American public lost the willingness to sustain it. The same pattern, slower, quieter, but fundamentally identical, unfolded during the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan. Initial support gradually eroded under the weight of continuous deployment, rising costs, and the growing realization that the objectives being pursued were either unachievable or had never been clearly defined in the first place. Now overlay this pattern onto the current American domestic landscape. Inflation has squeezed household budgets for years. Housing costs in major metropolitan areas have reached levels that previous generations would have considered inconceivable. Healthcare costs continue rising. Infrastructure across the country shows visible deterioration. Public education systems face chronic underfunding. Millions of Americans carry student loan debt that constrains their economic mobility for decades. Into this environment, imagine a president announcing that the United States will commit 200,000 ground troops, at minimum, to a sustained military operation inside Iran. Imagine the estimated cost projections beginning at $500 billion per year and climbing. Imagine the casualty reports beginning to arrive. 10 per week, then 20, then 50. Imagine the veterans returning with traumatic brain injuries, lost limbs, and psychological wounds that the existing Veterans Affairs system is already struggling to treat. The political mathematics become brutal with extraordinary speed. Every casualty has a family, every family has a community, every community has a congressional representative who must face re-election. And every election cycle becomes a referendum on a war that shows no sign of ending. The pressure to withdraw builds not gradually, but exponentially. And yet withdrawal, once tens of thousands of troops are committed and hundreds have died, becomes politically impossible to frame as anything other than defeat. This is the domestic trap. Stay and bleed, leave and lose. There is no third option. Regional escalation network. Iran does not exist in isolation. Over several decades, Tehran has constructed a network of allied organizations, partner militias, and aligned political movements across the broader Middle East. This network, sometimes called the Axis of Resistance, includes powerful actors in Lebanon, Iraq, Syria, Yemen, and beyond. If American ground forces invade Iran, these networks do not sit quietly and wait for the outcome. They activate. Not because Tehran necessarily issues a direct order to each group, although it may, but because these organizations understand that the fall of Iran would fundamentally alter the regional power balance against all of them. Their survival is linked to Iran's survival. Their response is therefore not optional, it is existential. Missile and drone attacks targeting American military installations across the Gulf become a near certainty. Shipping through the Strait of Hormuz and the Bab el-Mandeb Strait at the southern entrance to the Red Sea faces sustained harassment. Energy infrastructure across the region, oil refineries, natural gas processing plants, pipeline junctions, power generation facilities becomes a target set. The economic consequences cascade globally. Oil prices spike. Insurance premiums for commercial shipping through the region become prohibitive. Global supply chains, already strained by years of disruption, face a new and sustained shock. European and Asian economies, dependent on Middle Eastern energy flows, experience immediate inflationary pressure. Financial markets react with volatility that compounds the economic damage. What began as a localized military operation against one country now radiates outward across an entire region and into the global economic system. The war is no longer contained. It has metastasized. And every new front, every new economic disruption, every new political crisis in an allied nation adds weight to the trap that is already closing around the invading force. Intelligence and alliance reliability. There is a quieter dimension to this trap that rarely makes headlines but has destroyed military campaigns throughout history. Foreign armies operating in unfamiliar territory depend heavily on local intelligence. They need people on the ground who know the terrain, who understand the political dynamics of individual towns and tribal areas, who can identify enemy positions and warn of impending ambushes. Without reliable local intelligence, even the most powerful military operates partially blind. In the early stages of an invasion, local partners may cooperate enthusiastically, motivated by shared objectives, financial incentives, or genuine opposition to the existing government. But as the conflict drags on, as civilian casualties mount, as the invading force demonstrates that it cannot quickly achieve its stated objectives, the reliability of those partnerships begins to erode. Local actors reassess their calculations. They begin hedging. Information that once flowed toward the invading force starts flowing in the other direction. Ambushes become more frequent and more precisely timed. Patrol routes that were considered secure suddenly become fatal. Forward operating bases face rocket and drone attacks that arrive with suspicious accuracy, as if someone knew exactly when the defensive shifts changed and where the gaps in coverage existed. Soldiers begin to feel watched. Every interaction with a local civilian carries suspicion. Every piece of intelligence is questioned. Decision-making slows, operational tempo decreases, morale, the invisible foundation upon which every military campaign ultimately rests, begins to crack. And once morale collapses, no amount of technology, no volume of ammunition, no number of reinforcements can rebuild it fast enough to matter. Systemic trap synthesis. Step back now from each individual piece and see the entire system as it actually functions. Geography channels the invading force into predictable corridors where defenders hold every advantage. Logistics stretch across thousands of miles of vulnerable supply routes that the enemy has spent decades learning how to disrupt. Regional actors escalate the conflict beyond its original boundaries, creating new fronts and new crises faster than planners can adapt. Domestic politics fracture under the weight of casualties and costs, creating unbearable pressure to end the campaign without any viable path to do so. Local intelligence networks deteriorate, leaving the military operating in an information vacuum. And each of these problems feeds the others. Logistic failures erode morale. Morale failures reduce operational effectiveness. Reduced effectiveness increases casualties. Increased casualties intensify domestic opposition. Domestic opposition constrains strategic options. Constrained options prevent adaptation. This is not a list of separate problems. This is a system, a self-reinforcing cycle that tightens with every passing week. Phase 1, initial military success. Airfields destroyed, border defenses overrun, early objectives captured. Headlines at home declare progress. Phase 2, logistics strain begins. Supply convoys are ambushed, fuel deliveries slow, ammunition reserves at forward positions drop below comfortable levels. Phase 3, regional escalation spreads the conflict. Attacks on Gulf, shipping spike. Allied bases across the region come under fire. Energy prices surge globally. Phase 4, domestic political pressure rises. Casualty counts climb, costs mount. Public support erodes, congressional hearings begin. Phase 5, withdrawal becomes politically impossible. Too many soldiers have died to admit failure. Too much money has been spent to walk away. And so the commitment deepens, not because the strategy is working, but because admitting it is not working is more painful than continuing. The trap is complete. Strategic conclusion. None of this analysis is hidden. None of it is classified. The maps are available to anyone. The logistics models have been studied for decades. The historical parallels are well documented. Military planners, intelligence analysts, and strategic advisors inside every relevant institution understand these constraints with precision and clarity. The problem has never been a lack of information. The problem is that wars often begin anyway, driven by miscalculation, driven by political pressure, driven by economic interests, and driven by the oldest and most dangerous human impulse in strategic affairs, the belief that this time will be different. The real question is never whether the United States can win battles inside Iran. The real question is whether the entire campaign can escape the system that geography, logistics, politics, and regional escalation begin constructing around it from the very first day. Because once that system activates, once those forces begin interacting with each other in ways that no single decision maker can control, the battlefield stops being a place on a map. It becomes something far more dangerous. A machine that consumes everything fed into it. Soldiers, equipment, money, political capital, national prestige, without ever producing the outcome that anyone originally promised. And the only people who understand that machine are the ones who have studied the wars that came before. The ones who know that the most dangerous moment in any conflict is not when things go wrong. It is when things appear to be going right.